Hi, everybody. I'm Kelly Puyer. I'm very happy to be with you today to launch a series of events called This Is Not a Pirate. This series is a milestone for the Museum of Care, for Nika Dubrovsky, and for me as project initiator. For the Museum of Care, why? Because like all the other projects of the Museum of Care, this is working on David's legacy, challenging the status quo, looking at other possibilities. For Nika, because I know that this topic is very dear to her, with David, they had started a project called Anthropology for Kids, which included a topic related to pirates. And I know that Nika is continuing this work and is looking very much forward to the discussion today, as well as to the discussion in the coming months to feed that work. And for me too, because among everything that David did, his work related to what he called pirates of the Enlightenment is the one that I treasure most. Firstly, because it refers to pirates from a region that I know very well, Madagascar. And secondly, because David's approach questions the fatherhood of our democratic principles, and as a human rights and social justice advocate who believe in the power of democracy, means a lot to me and makes me believe that another world is possible if we look at power relations differently. So looking at that, and as David has done in various research, including the dawn of everything that has been published last year, David introduces new actors who were among the true pioneers of our democracies. These included pirates who established themselves in Madagascar in the 18th century, but also women with whom they lived, or Malagasy people with whom they built their utopian experiments. David's finding, therefore, questions the way history is being told and has been told for centuries, and how misleading this has been to build the societies in which we live today. So in the way, the Belgian painter Magritte denounced some treachery of images, which inspired us for the title of this series, we launched today This Is Not a Pirate, to expose aspects of our history that should have been told differently. And who could kickstart this dialogue better than Marcus Rediker, distinguished professor of Atlantic history at the University of Pittsburgh, activist for many peace and social justice projects and causes, and winner of numerous awards for his publication telling histories from below. So thank you very much, Marcus, for accepting our invitation. It's a real honor to have you with us today to launch this event series. And so to start our dialogue, the floor is yours to tell us more about the concept of history from below and how that applies to pirates. And I would be particularly interested to know also in that concept and in that context, what is your definition of a pirate and how that may differ from the traditional view that people have of pirates?
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Nika. Thanks to everyone who made this event possible. It's great to be with you. I have great admiration for David and his work, and so that makes this an honor to be part of the launch of this series. So let's start with history from below. History from below is a way of approaching the past. It is a variant of social history. It is sometimes called radical history or people's history. Howard Zinn quite famously wrote A People's History of the United States. It's sometimes called engaged history. But I think the key point is that history from below is written in relationship to movements from below. In other words, it is an active kind of history, activist kind of history, and you might even say an insurgent kind of history. The first use of the phrase history from below goes back to the 1930s, itself a radical decade. And the French historian Lucien Febvre used the phrase in 1932. It was later used by a close colleague of his, Georges Lefebvre, the great historian of the French Revolution. He began to talk a lot about history from below. And then the essence of the idea was captured by none other than Bertolt Brecht in a poem of 1935, really right around the same time the phrase appears. And this poem is called A Worker Reads History. And it begins with very famous lines. Who built the 7 gates of Thebes? The books are filled with the names of kings. But was it kings who hauled the craggy blocks of stone? And he goes on to illustrate the way top-down history has been written and taught and learned for many, many generations. Mm-hmm. But this is kind of the anthem of history from below, this poem by Brecht, A Worker Reads History. I would urge you to read it. And as I've said, history from below is linked to movements. So it will come as no surprise that there was an extraordinary explosion of history from below in the 1960s and 1970s. In my view, the most powerful early movement in this regard was the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, both of which demanded a new history, taking race and slavery seriously, not only in the United States, but around the world. So this is a tremendous motor force for the emergence of history from below. The same can be said of the anti-war movement, specifically the protests against the war in Vietnam, which demanded a new history of imperialism. And of course, one of the biggest challenges for history from below came from the women's movement, which demanded that the larger part of humanity be included in our writing about the past. So these movements raised really important political questions about history. Who's in? Who's out? Who's included? Who's excluded? Whose history is it? So history from below makes that claim. Now, history from below is a way of approaching the past, but it is also a tradition of historical writing. This work has been going on for a very long time. A rich, complex body of scholarship globally has been done. I'll mention 3 figures who were very important to me personally, and I think to a lot of others. First, C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian scholar activist, wrote a famous book called The Black Jacobins, A History of the Haitian Revolution from Below. E.P. Thompson, the British Marxist historian, wrote The Making of the English Working Class in 1963. And another classic is Christopher Hill's book, The World Turned Upside Down, Radical Ideas During the English Revolution in 1972. That book was a kind of intellectual history from below, which has some resonance with David's work. So just to finish up this part of the presentation, I see 6 essential elements in history from below. It has 6 essential parts. First of all, working people are its subject. Okay, that's just a starting place. Secondly, history from below always treats questions of power and oppression and resistance as they are joined historically. That's point number 2. Point number 3, history from below talks about the experience of ordinary people. 4, it talks about the consciousness of ordinary people. 5, it tries to recover the voices of these ordinary people, these working people. And finally, history from below is all about the agency that these people, these working people, exercised. It's about agency, or as C.L.R. James put it, self-activity, things that people did to free themselves from exploitation and oppression. And then a last point on this subject, history from below is without a doubt the most democratic kind of history. In fact, you can see this entire movement as an effort to democratize history away from the elite propertied white men who were its dominant subjects for many generations. Everyone is included in history from below, and that's a key point. Turning to pirates, you know, a pirate, in terms of a definition, is essentially someone who commits robbery at sea. And the oldest interpretation of piracy is basically one that arose contemporaneously with piracy itself during the golden age of pirates. And this was created by the people who wanted to exterminate them. These are the ruling classes of the day who were angry about the pirates' attack on the property of merchants. So they called pirates wild beasts, monsters, thugs, criminals. So this is basically the earliest interpretation of pirates from above. That was not the view from below. Working people viewed pirates in a different way from the beginning. Slowly and over time, I'm just trying to give a very broad overview here. Writers like Robert Louis Stevenson and many others, and then eventually Hollywood, created a romantic image of the pirate. And this was frequently an aristocrat who had been wronged, who had gone to sea to recover justice. But within this vision, and this remains true even in Pirates of the Caribbean, the films very recently, the rank and file pirate, the image of the rank and file pirate is still that of basically a drunken, violent thug with bad hair and worse teeth, right? We're talking about class stereotypes. Now, the real historical and scholarly study of pirates was quite limited until recently. Piracy always attracted a lot of writers, amateur writers, and many of them were actually very good and did serious research, but a new generation, you might say, came on over the last 20 to 25 years, looking at pirates in a new way, specifically in terms of the social history or the history from below. Now, one slightly humorous personal thing here is that I wrote this book called Villains of All Nations, Atlantic Pirates in the Golden Age in 2004, and that was going to be my swan song. That was going to be the last thing I ever had to say about pirates. I had published an article about them in 1981, and I discovered that once you've written about pirates, the phone never stops ringing because everybody loves them and wants to know about them. So I've discovered that even though I made that vow, I'm done with pirates, you can never really escape them. And that's because of the place they occupy in our collective imagination. Now, one of the discoveries of this recent phase of piracy is that a pirate is not a single unitary monolithic category of person. Pirates differed widely through time and space. Important to realize this. But the one generation that continues to stand out, I think, in terms of both popular culture and scholarship, is the generation of the early 18th century, roughly 1720s. This is the generation of Blackbeard. This is the generation of the Black Flag, the Jolly Roger with the skull and the crossbones. And this was the generation that I wrote about in Villains of All Nations. So my observations are primarily about them. So this social history of pirates, it has a different question that it proceeds from. It's not about whether pirates broke the law or not. It asks an opening question: who were they? Turns out they were just ordinary, common, exploited sailors. Second question: what did they think they were doing when they turned pirate? What were their purposes? Was it to get rich quick? Well, yeah, but it was more complicated than that. These poor sailors, it turns out, I learned, were trapped in a deadly capitalist system of low wages, very poor quality food, extremely violent discipline, and high mortality. By the way, the skull and crossbones you see on a pirate flag, sailors took that from the logbooks of captains who would write a skull and a crossbone to indicate the death of a sailor. So they use this symbol of death as a symbol of resistance. So they capture ships and they organize themselves in stunningly new ways. Now remember that the naval ships and merchant ships of the day had rigid hierarchies, right? Violent discipline. So what do pirates do? They organize themselves democratically. They elect their captain, and they get rid of the captain if the captain doesn't treat everybody fairly or well. They limit the use of punishment. The crew votes collectively on whether someone is to be punished or not. The captain doesn't have arbitrary power. Moreover, they divide up their loot in this incredibly equal way. It's kind of shocking. You know, it could hardly be more different from the Navy or the merchant service. They abolished the wage system. They created a share system for dividing up loot. And they did all these things at a time, I want to emphasize, when poor people throughout Europe and in most parts of the world had no democratic rights anywhere. So they're practicing democracy on board these ships in a really important early way in the history of that idea. This, of course, is one that David has picked up on. So this is a very subversive idea, that you can run a ship in a different way. And so in addition to the attacks on merchant property, the ruling classes of the day saw that the pirates were providing such a powerful example to common sailors, and one that was so antithetical to the way that they organized naval and merchant ships, that they undertook a campaign to exterminate as many pirates as they could. And they hanged them in the hundreds. They would then hang up their bodies in chains at the entrance to port cities so that sailors on inbound ships would see them. And the message was, if you dare to try to live differently, we will hunt you down and we will kill you. Okay, so there's a kind of brief bottom-up history of pirates. Kelly, do you have more questions?
Yes, thank you very much for this history of piracy and how this relates to what you just mentioned, which is, powerful examples of democracy, which is, I guess, the reason why they have been presented in the way they have. So what is it that we wanted to promote or to protect by presenting the pirates in this way comes clear to what you've just presented. The societies around there were not democratic. But what's important also to understand, because you were talking also of movements from below, and the link between understanding the past and building on the future, is how would you understand the development based on this way of looking at history, the problem of storytelling? Who has the power to impose the way pirates have been presented from the moment from the 18th centuries to today?
Well, I hope that the people who are listening to this presentation are asking yourself, why was I never taught this about pirates? Why was I never taught about their self-organization? Why was I never taught about their democratic ideals? Well, it turns out it's not that you are ignorant, it's that your ignorance has a structure that was put there by the way you were educated, okay? Because there is a vested political interest in presenting history in a certain way, in a top-down way that glorifies great men. And this, of course, is to protect systems of private property. That's a major purpose. It's also to limit the knowledge of alternative ways of living in the world. I mean, part of hegemony is forcing people to think that there is really only one way. Well, so who decides? What gets included in our history has always been a shockingly political business. I mean, this is a very old idea, and it's premised on a phrase that I'm sure everyone here has heard. That is, the winners write the history. This is crucial. Winners write the history. But movements come along and basically say, no, that's not enough. We've got to have something new. Let's remember what Brecht said, posing that question. Who built the seven gates of Thebes? Who built the world we live in? Who created the wealth that we all have all around us? So who's included? Who's excluded? Whose history are we writing, teaching? So as these movements from below demand new histories, a struggle over the meaning of history intensifies, and that is what we have going on right now in post-George Floyd America. After the murder of George Floyd, or the public execution, we might say, there has been a powerful new set of demands about racial justice, that the past must include teaching about that subject, struggles for freedom, but we're also seeing a tremendous backlash. So I guess what I would say is that the stronger the movements from below at any given moment in time, the greater the likelihood that the progressive version or bottom-up version of our past will be taught. It ebbs and flows according to the strengths of these movements.
So would that be elements of your recipe if we now want to build a bottom-up society? How would you approach that? Because it's clear that the implication of the way history has been told to us is something that we still live in today, and that prevents us from having this bottom-up approach. So how to challenge that, and how to develop new ways of making society together in a more equal, in a more inclusive way.
Well, let me add one more point about the purposes of teaching history. Something I should have said a moment ago. If you look at the way in which most nation states, especially imperial nation states, teach history, they have one basic goal, which is to teach a version of history that will make young men and women willing to die in foreign wars for the version of history they've been taught. And there is some very interesting, there are very interesting reasons to wonder, if people get a truthful history, will that political goal actually be achieved? And I would just mention that in the 1990s, there was a fierce debate about the content of American history. The social historians got together a whole new set of American history standards, just the best scholarship of the day, and the US Senate voted it down 99-1 against, for one clear reason, which is, quote, insufficiently patriotic, end quote. So there's a political struggle. So what must we do differently? We've got to take that approach from below. We've got to reject the dominant mythology. We've got to look from below and see what people did to free themselves from exploitation and oppression in different moments of history. We've got to understand that real change comes from below, and to understand how people themselves in movements are makers of that history, what kind of roles they have played in that history. This, I think, is the way that we arrive at a different understanding of not only where we've been, but where we might go. Because if you see the things people struggled for in the past, it can expand your mind and your ability to see something different.
Thank you very much. I think we might open the floor at this stage, because I'm sure participants have questions, and then we can continue based on that. So does anybody want to ask questions directly? If not, you can put them in the chat. I see Florian.
So Nika, you were first. Do you want to ask your question? I'd be happy to, although I think the questions in the chat were a lot earlier. Maybe you want to start with them, not to keep people waiting.
That's all right, Florian, now you're speaking.
So I wanted to ask about the connections of these 18th century pirate societies to those of the 17th century, where you have those so-called buccaneers who seem to be a lot more connected to the goals of states and to elite goals. So how does that shift happen to them suddenly becoming subalterns? Because, for example, this idea of equal share of voting, basically democratic ideas, as you said, that is already reported in mid-17th century sources like Esquemelin. So what happens to turn them from basically tools of empires into enemies of empires and total subalterns, as you describe them?
Thank you. Yes, it turns out that there are actually three discrete generations of pirates within the Golden Age, which runs from about 1660 to 1730. The first, as you say, are the buccaneers, and they are employed to a considerable extent by the English government to attack the mineral wealth of New Spain, a kind of primitive accumulation. In the 1690s comes a second generation. The key figure there would be William Kidd. But at this moment, what's happened is that in England, at least, the ruling class has decided that it stands to gain more from the plantation agriculture of the Caribbean than it stands to gain from piratical activities. So they turn against piracy. William Kidd is executed. He actually had the backing of some very high-level merchants and government officials. And so at that's kind of a turning point. So by the time the pirates of the third generation come along in the 17 teens and 1720s, the upper classes are no longer connected. So each of these successive generations of pirates is more radicalized and more anti-national in a very real sense. So we have to look at this element of change over time within the golden age of piracy. And we see that by the end, by the third generation, it's a very proletarian operation. Big merchants and government officials are very rarely involved anymore. So that's the change you're talking about.
You say England now, but of course there were the French, the Dutch are organizing these kind of expeditions in the 17th century too. So how do these different national traditions, if you want to call them that, how does that affect each other in that shift?
Okay, quickly, because it's a complicated question. Antipathy to pirates was one of the few things that could unite the empires in a common cause. So people who are mortal enemies and fighting over the trade routes will come together against pirates. There are very similar things among the French. The French have a major problem with pirates in the early 18th century as well. But England really takes the lead. They are the ones who hang the greatest majority. France does something, but England has a much stronger military and naval force, and they project that force over the seas to eradicate pirates.
Thank you so much.
So now we're going to...
very much. Yeah, I think, Vasily, can you just summarize and tell us about the questions from the
We're going to take those questions, then Christian's questions. Maybe Christian, you can only ask, choose one of your questions, and maybe Trevor after that, okay? So 3 questions from now, and if we have time, we'll take more, okay? So this is your...
Okay. Hi, Marcus.
Oh, sorry.
Lovely
Hi, Joe.
To see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, it's lovely to see you. I've got blue hair at the moment. Last time you saw me, it was pink. Anyway, yeah, I just wanted to kind of ask a little bit about source material. I mean, as you know, I kind of work on the earlier period, sort of 17th century. And some of the approach that I take is looking at, popular culture, so plays, ballads, this kind of thing, as well as looking at the archival material and trying to read through the lines. I mean, petitions, particularly from the women, for example, the kind of the wives of pirates and so on, can come in useful. But I wondered what material you were accessing, and how you read it. How do you, read that from below?
Okay, great question, because I should have said, Joe, and thank you for that, that probably the greatest challenge of history from below is finding sources, because we are talking about people, many of whom did not even read or write. They were storytellers in the oral tradition, so their stories are kind of gone on the wind. We don't know. So the first thing I would say in answer to your question is that you have to figure out how societies produce documentation about poor people who are involved with the sea. And of course, that almost immediately brings up the courts, because poor people are almost always in court, almost always some portion of them on the wrong side of the law. And so you can get sometimes surprisingly rich sources in these court cases. I had worked in the High Court of Admiralty papers, which are a tremendously rich source. Once you get the sources, then to quote our friend E.P. Thompson, what you do is you hold them up to a satanic light and read them backwards. I always thought this was a great phrase for how you do history from below, because that's sort of an allusion to what was done with witches, because the idea was if you could read backwards, then you were a witch. So I think Thompson is saying that witches would probably make the best social historians. So it's all a matter of doing as you've done, Joe, and looking for as many varieties of sources as you can find, the ballads, the songs, everything, and then reading those as creatively as possible. And then the larger the base grows, the more you have an ability to judge the fragments about what fits with everything else. So yeah, this is actually a big challenge for history from below, how to find and interpret sources.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. But lots of fun. That's the joy of it.
Lots of fun. That's right.
Covering those voices is the joy of it. So yeah,
good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's what good with taking important topics as the one discussing today, but shaping it in a pirate story. Because and this is what David said also, that he's inviting us while reading his books related to pirates to also have fun and discover fun aspects of history. Vasily, what's in the chat? I think a lot is coming in now.
Christian wanted to ask a couple of questions.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. I wonder if you look at these democracies or republics that appeared on these pirate ships at these times in the around the Americas, and if you look at the ideas advanced in the dawn of everything, where they have the communication that goes back from the Jesuits in the north of America to France to kind of help the Enlightenment a bit along. I mean, you see the geographic proximity here. So do we have any idea if these were influenced by the same kind of thoughts that came from the natives, or were picked up by the Jesuits and then transported to America, or if there's some kind of a connection you can point to?
I think this is a very important point. I mean, this is, Peter Linebaugh and I wrote a book called The Many-Headed Hydra, which is all about this motley Atlantic proletariat in the 17th and 18th centuries. I do think that a lot of the egalitarian ideas, the democratic ideas that are circulating within that group and then back to the salons of Europe have Native American origins. And I think this is really critical, because one of the things, as David has pointed out, it was quite shocking to European rulers to discover these classless societies, many of them, that didn't have proper kings. And this had a really shocking effect on, I think, the development of European social theory. So I think, but see, here's the thing. One of the things that I think David has done very well is he's raised a lot of the questions about history from below to the level of political theory, so that we can think better about how the people who we normally thought of as the great thinkers, Sir Thomas More, Shakespeare, Locke, Montesquieu, how they were actually engaged with these other more radical ideas that have come from afar and come across the seas. And I'll just give one example. The great French humanist Montaigne wrote, it may have been his most famous essay. It was called Of Cannibals. I think it was published in 1580s. And in that essay, he was writing about some indigenous people in Brazil. He makes the point that they are not the cannibals, the Europeans are. So he inverts the categories of analysis. Well, that essay is very well known. What is not well known is that Montaigne employed a servant who had been a sailor, who had been to Brazil, and who brought back stories of the peoples, the indigenous peoples that he met there. So this is another way in which these ideas circulate. They don't just circulate on the printed page. They circulate in stories. They circulate in accounts that the peoples of this Atlantic world told to each other. So to access that is again another challenge, but really an essential one.
And I think looking into this webinar as a series, this is something that we will hopefully develop in the coming months. And in his study and his book related to pirates, David already mentions people like Candiaron, who was the Huron chief here in North America. And so there are many stories that we can follow up with, and that goes exactly in that same direction.
Trevor, would you like to ask your question? And your mic is off. You're not audible.
Sorry, am I audible now? Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Marcus. It's a very interesting discussion. I was thinking myself of your book with Peter Leinbau, The Many-Headed Hydra, and the point you make about taking all the different heads of the Hydra, taking that metaphor that was used by the ruling classes literally, and seeing it as a sort of a linked set of resistances to authoritarian law. And I was thinking, you've got the pirates at sea beyond the boundaries of the nation states, but you got smugglers who exist on the borders, penetrating in both directions these borders and the realm of law. I'm thinking particularly of just one example, because I'm no expert in all of this, of the famous Irish pirate queen Grace O'Malley of the 17th century, who actually had an audience with Queen Elizabeth. But her ships, they were famously, she was the pirate queen, and they did some piracy in a fairly standard sense, I think. They were also long established smugglers, of course, on the western seaboard of Ireland, and going down to Iberia and north as well, I think on some occasions to Scotland. But also they operated as a channel for proscribed it's traveling to Spain and the other Catholic countries between there and Ireland. So it's as it were, it's a sort of a zone that's linked to the zone of the pirates, but it's actually existing half on the mainland. I'd like to know if you have any thoughts about this.
Yes, I think it's actually a crucial point. And I have a colleague named Nicholas Frickman who is studying this at this very moment, about the way in which the advance of empires really depends upon conquering their own maritime frontiers for the sake of power control, revenues, and all the rest, so that the struggle against pirates and the struggle against smugglers are linked. And of course, in a lot of places, one might easily pass from one of those activities to the other. So there's an experiential connection as well. So I think it's really useful to talk about these sort of in-between zones, right? I mean, the high seas is a crucible for thinking and acting, but these people who are partly, we might call them amphibious, they're on land, but they're back and forth between land and sea. They sometimes are the brokers of these radical ideas because they too are in kind of a liminal state where they're going back and forth and able to project ideas and bring radical ideas back to the land so that they can circulate more effectively there. But thank you, Trevor, for that question. I think that's a strategic zone, those sort of coastlines.
Yeah, and the wreckers, of course, also exist there. Another, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chris, please jump in.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks, Vasily, and thanks, Marcus. I'm just interested in your thoughts on the independent Republic of Sala. Because your sort of 3 stages of pirates, as you outlined it, seem to exist after that, and yet there's a sort of sense that, obviously the Barbary Corsairs were largely operating, on behalf of the Ottoman Empire and some other powerful empires. But my understanding is that in Sala, they did declare independence, running first with a president of their own and later with a divan council, and then the sort of democratic sort of ideals of running a pirate ship somehow found their way onto land sometime earlier in the 17th century, before we get to the sort of golden age of piracy. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that, really, in relation to your earlier taxonomy.
Yeah, Chris, I have not studied the Salé pirates, but I do, if I'm not mistaken, understand that you're making a film about them. Am I right?
Yeah, I am. Yeah.
You might be the best person to answer the question.
Yeah.
But here's what I would say. One of the most important things to understand about maritime culture is that it is genuinely international, and it has been for hundreds and hundreds of years. If you go back and look at the crew lists of the people who accompanied Columbus and Magellan around the world, they are extremely multi-ethnic and multinational. There are Black sailors, there are Muslim sailors, there are sailors from Greece, Mediterranean, the North Sea. They're from all over the place. And what that means is that the cooperation of these people on board the ships allows for a transmission of their ideas and practices from one ship to another. So I think that it's very likely that there are some common elements, very important common elements, between the Mediterranean-based pirates and the Atlantic-based pirates, simply because they would have been on some of the same ships, regardless of the fact that there might have been major struggles over religion, which of course it doesn't mean that people don't influence each other. It doesn't mean that they don't partake of some of the same ideas because they seem useful under the circumstances, right? So again, we're back to this circulation of hidden ideas, on the lower decks of ships. And I think tracing these things out is really a crucial thing to do. So I think your film has an important job ahead of it.
Thank you very much.
Tatagata had a question.
Hi. I guess I had a couple of questions. I'll club them. The first one is this, I think, is kind of motivated by what my understanding is from following some of David's works, particularly his research methods. I mean, in this specific context, for instance, this question of whether, so the kind of history that we are often fed, right? It seems to argue that piracy is some kind of a reaction to sort of legalism, right? I mean, the kind of, sort of that kind of the powers of legalism. But I was just wondering, like, how much of it would you say is perhaps in fact the reverse? I mean, legalism as perhaps a kind of reaction to what we are calling democratic organizations, such as piracy. I would like take the liberty to sort of also attach the second question to this, which is like, for young researchers like some of us, could you point us to some resources that we should look up to know more about sort of histories from below in the context of piracy and smuggling in sort of the the Bay of Bengal, Indian Ocean worlds. And I mean, like, if I would also kind of maybe even go ahead to sort of request, if possible in the long run, we could try to think of organizing maybe a workshop where some of us could, you all could sort of train some of us to do this kind of research, because clearly not enough work has happened on some of these questions to the extent that they need to.
Yeah, I think that latter point is really a good one, because I think the rise of transnational history and specifically oceanic history these are some of the most important developments in historical writing over the past 20 years or so. And I would emphasize that the Indian Ocean is an especially dynamic area of scholarship at the moment. But yes, with regard to your first question, there's absolutely no question that developments I mean, piracy is in many ways a response to the law of private property, which is highly developed. But it's also true that the law of private property evolves in response to pirates. And I'll just give you one specific example. I mentioned earlier in response to Florian's question that there was a kind of radicalization of pirates over time, and that the larger merchants tended to drop out of their connections were lost. They abandoned the pirates. They were too dangerous to deal with. What pirates started doing was dealing with small merchants in the Caribbean, for example, or in North America. In 1721, the British Parliament passed a law saying that if you trade with pirates, you are essentially a pirate yourself, and we will hang you too. So the evolution of the law of piracy is directly following from the actions. So we've really got to see these things as kind of organically interrelated. I think that's an important thing for us, because look, the ruling classes of this era in, let's say, the 18th century, they're constantly having to respond to initiatives from below. Whether those are strikes or riots or whatever they might be, those people don't make the decisions. It's not widely known, but the term strike emerges in 1768 when a group of sailors in a protest against wage cuts go around to the vessels of their ship, striking the sails. You strike the sail to take down the sail. That is the practice, a maritime phrase. And that is the origin of a new kind of working class power. Well, the British government is going to spend many years learning to deal with questions of strikes. So again, to see a really dialectical relationship from above and below, in which each is responding to the other, is important. And I would say, by the way, history from below is kind of a rhetorical assertion, but history from below is always about power from above. It has to be.
So we are going to take two more questions. Mark, you're next, and then it will be Christina. And I'm so sorry about, I'm sorry if you wanted to ask a question and we couldn't take it. We are a bit, constrained. Mark?
Yes, this is fascinating. I was wondering if you were able to discern a change in the sort of intentionality of pirate self-organization after the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. So property had changed, the idea of property, but also no doubt all the discussions and ideas floating around with that sort of cargo. And I can't imagine any ship who might have mutinied would not resort to the same sort of pirate self-organization after the fact.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's a good question, Mark. I wrote a good bit about this in my book. It turns out that a significant number of pirates, I can't give you a percentage, but a significant number of them had worked in the slave trade, where the conditions for sailors, as for the enslaved, were quite deadly. It's also true that pirates organized their rounds, their attacks on merchant ships off the West African coast, hoping to capture slave ships before they took on board any human cargo, because it turned out that kind of ship was a very useful pirate ship. They were fast, they had a lot of cannon and all the rest. So this then prompts English merchants to say, pirates are destroying the slave trade. They're interfering with one of our most valuable kinds of trade. And that actually results in action whereby naval vessels are dispatched to the west coast of Africa. HMS Swallow in 1722 engages in this extraordinary battle with the biggest pirate of that era, a man named Black Bart Roberts. And they won that battle, the Navy, and this is in some ways the beginning of the end. So the slave trade figures into this very importantly. But the other point that I would mention is that a very significant percentage of almost every pirate ship I have ever seen consists of sailors of African descent. We know, for example, that there was a very interesting and revealing bit of evidence about a revolt that took place in one of the Caribbean islands. It might have been Antigua. There was a big kind of slave conspiracy brewing, but the leaders of the revolt actually stole a vessel and rowed out to a pirate ship that was anchored offshore, and the pirates welcomed them aboard. They became members of the crew. So this then gets to the question of why would pirates have done that? Well, I think they probably, first of all, respected them as fighters, right? This becomes, if you can fight, if you have military skill, that's something that pirates really want. So there are functional elements as to why these crews are so multiracial. But I think this issue of Africa and the slave trade and enslaved people joining pirate ships is a really fascinating part of the story.
Thank you, Marcus. We're going to take the last question. Katerina? Christina, sorry, my bad.
Hi, Professor Rediker. It's lovely to see you. I took one of your courses a long time ago.
I remember.
You still had a huge impact on me.
Good to see you.
You too. So I kind of don't really have a question, but it's more a comment. I'm seeing a lot of similarities between, I'm thinking of Canada, the trucker convoy. There's flags waving. There's big vehicles blocking everything. They're protesting mask mandates, I believe. But I wonder if you could kind of, say a little bit about the consequences of not knowing the history from below. It seems like the spirit is there, what they're protesting, but it's being manipulated in some way.
That's right. Now, it's, this is an interesting and complicated question because, as I mentioned, history from below is about experience, and frequently that is working class experience. But people can have the same experience and interpret it in different ways, right? So there is a powerful ideological element in the way in which people will act. See, it's also true that there is agency that is sometimes activated for racist or sexist or other kinds of ends. David Rediker wrote this book, The Wages of Whiteness, in which he talked about the effort within the labor movement of 19th century America to keep Black workers out, right? That was, in a sense, that was kind of their agency. So we have to be, careful in how we look at all these things, but we also have to consider the relationship that a lot of people have, for example, to the state, and the tremendous distrust that people have of the state. I don't know the situation in Canada nearly as well, but the issue of vaccination in the US is closely linked to the fact that a lot of people just don't trust the government at all. And in some cases, they've got pretty good reasons for not trusting them. African-American people in particular, after you look at some of the medical experiments that have been carried out on their bodies, is it any wonder? So I guess it is important to know that that history from below can take many different forms and many different ideological sort of shadings.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for these last questions, which puts a bridge between the past and the present. And this is exactly what we want to do with these webinars, is really to understand how better understanding the past will help us better build the future. I also see that there are many more questions, and that's also the spirit of these projects that we are launching today. We will look at all the questions and hopefully start a dialogue with all of you. So you're very much welcome to continue putting comments. We will save that and see what we do with all this. It might be an idea for a future webinar, or we might come back to you with some answers that would have remained unanswered. And I think that's also the good moment to introduce to you what in this series and in this webinar, we call the Treachery Revealer, meaning this additional person that we have invited, who's been listening to everything that you've said and that Professor Rediker has presented, and who will highlight some other treachery of history. And this is Stefan Snelders. So welcome, Stefan. He's also an historian. He's also participated already in events of the Museum of Care. And Stefan will be the speaker of our next webinar next month. So give us a little teaser based on what you've learned today. How do we continue that?
Let's first put on my mic. Thank you, Kelly, for this. And thank you, Marcus, for the presentation, and everybody for their questions. Well, to tease a little, there's one treachery which is famously not discussed today. Marcus rightly points out to the importance of the way history presents people as pirates, such as pirates. His emphasis is on the working class concept, the social history, the labor history of pirates. But we live in a day and age in which we tend to take an even bigger picture of the exploitation in our world. So there's another treachery in which pirate history actually could be very interesting, and that is our treacheries against the sea. So the sea, the oceans are at extreme risk today. I don't have to explain that to you. And there's a new, I would say, development in history in which we try to put people in the context of everything else on the planet. So pirates, for instance, are not just autonomous human beings, but their whole activities are very much determined, made possible by the fact that they participate in, I would say, coalitions with the sea, with the ships. So in all these pirate stories, the wind, storms, at the time you need to get somewhere, which is unbelievable to us today. These are all very important aspects, and I think quite important to understand pirates on their own terms. But it's also of political importance because there's a lot of discussion now going on who actually controls the ocean, who is responsible for the oceans. But the whole idea, the discussion about that, about the closed sea, the mare clausum, or the free sea, the mare liberum, actually dates from the 17th century. And the aim of the British Navy to control piracy also was very much about controlling the oceans and the sea itself. So this is a little treachery, which I think we might delve into next time, if that's understandable to everybody.
Thank you, Marcus. And thank you, Stefan, also for these additional elements that you have identified and that we will look into in the future webinar, as well as looking a bit more in details in the social organization also in the ships. And this is also something that Marcus had started to introduce, talking about strikes, talking about wages before. There is a whole source of information that we have there and that we will further dig into in the coming webinars. But before closing, I will give the floor to Nika. I introduced her in the very beginning of this webinar, and then the final word will be to Marcus to close.
Yeah, thank you everyone who came, and of course Kelly, who conceived and prepared and implemented it all. And thank you for Marcus for excellent talk and for the books that I read, and as I told him in the beginning, gave as a present to my friends. So I just want to say that for David, his book that calls Pirate Enlightenment, or the Real Libertaria, Bacaria's Woman Traders and Mock Kingdom in the 18th century Madagascar. So this was his most like very, very dear book that hopefully we're going to publish soon. And it's so happens that his first book was about Madagascar, and his last book that would be published after his death also will be about Madagascar pirates. So that's yeah, that's how all these projects are framed in a way. So I also want to say, for me, his first books, Lost People, is very much connected to the Russian tradition, to Mikhail Bakhtin, who wrote this book, Poetic of Dostoevsky, and actually first time showed how the human society is never always multiple storytelling. So it's never one storytelling. So it's polyphony, and that was the first discovery of David, and that's like totally very important about storytelling, about our society, about David's legacy, about everything. And as well as the last video that David filmed was about the pirate books, children pirate books that also hopefully going to be published soon. And I'm just looking forward of more projects and friendship and collaboration. So please write to us, and let's continue all of that. That was wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Nika.
Okay, let me, in concluding, say a few more words about David. Because as I mentioned earlier, what he does in the Pirate Enlightenment, which is, by the way, I think, the most interesting book written about pirates in a long time. What he does in that book is really quite extraordinary, because he shifts our vision of where political ideas come from who qualifies as a thinker. So this is, I regard this book in some ways as a kind of intellectual history from below. So that the traditional figures that we think about, as making this, sort of the philosophers, Locke and Hume and many of the great French thinkers, suddenly now are in dialogue with a very different group of people whom they probably never would rub shoulders with in daily life, although they encountered their ideas. So part of the power of that book is to make us see that this motley crew of workers were not only workers, they were thinkers, and they were makers of history. That's the other thing about history from below. They pioneer ideas, they pioneer practices, and they change sometimes the very trajectory of history. Okay, so that to me is important. I look forward to future discussion of this book. And then one final closing irony, okay, which I think is really apt for this group at this time. Pirates lost the battle in their own day, did they not? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them were hanged. This ruthless Atlantic ruling class hunted them down and killed them. But here we are still talking about these pirates 300 years later. Do we remember the names of the people who executed them? No, we don't. But we do remember the pirates because something in them, something in their radical vision of freedom still means something to us. So I think it's a great irony that they may have lost the battle, but I think they're winning the war. And books like The Pirate Enlightenment help in winning that war. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marcus, for these very engaging last words. I think it's up to you and to us all together to see and to act so that this war is finally won in the name of our ancestors and of our children. So I thank all of you for having been with us today to launch this series. I very much look forward to the future webinars, but also any type of projects that might emerge from the discussions today. As I said, it's a process. It's not an end in itself. I also wanted to use these last minute to thank some people, to thank obviously our speakers today, our keynote speaker, Marcus Rediker. Thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. Stefan, also, thank you for coming today and for being with us next time. Thank you to Nika and to all the Museum of Care colleagues who've been with us and helping to organize that event, especially Vasily, who's been helping me in the last weeks with that. Thanks also to Christopher Noon, who's been with us today and will help me doing the editing of that video. And also to somebody who's, I think, not here today, Rich Britnell, who gave us the right to use his picture for the logo of our event. So we have adapted what he had made for other purposes, and I thank him also for allowing that.